She smiled and said it calmly, like it was a harmless fact. "He's not going anywhere. He wouldn't survive without me." The words landed in the middle of the table like a utensil dropped too hard, sharp sound, quick silence afterward. We were packed into a long booth in a crowded restaurant outside Columbus, Ohio. The kind with low lights and too much noise, where people lean in close and pretend they're not listening to the next conversation over. Someone laughed, tight, uncertain. Someone else stared at their plate like it had suddenly become complicated. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel shame. I felt clarity. Not the dramatic kind. The practical kind. The kind you get when a measurement finally lines up and you realize you've been forcing the tape to read what you wanted. I looked at Emma across the table. She didn't even glance at me when she said it. She was watching the reaction around her, letting it settle, enjoying the shape of it. And right there, with the clink of glasses and the hum of strangers behind us, I understood something clean and final. That was the exact moment my marriage ended. Before that night, my life looked stable from the outside in the way a fresh coat of paint can make an old door seem solid. I had a steady job, a decent truck that started every morning, and a mortgage payment that came out on time. We lived in a tidy place north of the city with gray siding and a narrow backyard that Emma kept presentable, the way she kept everything managed, trimmed, arranged for viewing. I worked operations for a commercial construction outfit. Not the kind of job people write about, but the kind that keeps job sites moving. Schedules, deliveries, subcontractors who needed reminders and, sometimes, gentle threats. I liked it because it was honest. You could see what got done. You could measure progress by what was standing at the end of the day. Emma was in medical sales, which meant she always sounded like she was halfway through a presentation. Even when we were alone, she talked in conclusions. She didn't ask what I thought so much as she told me what we'd decided. When she introduced me to people, it was always, "This is my husband, he keeps me grounded," like I was a weight tied to her ankle in case she drifted too high. We'd been married 7 years. No kids. Not because we didn't talk about it. We talked about it constantly. We just never arrived there. There was always a reason it had to wait until later. After her promotion, after my next raise, after the market settled, after we remodeled the kitchen, after we took that trip to Charleston she kept saving pins for. Later, became a room we lived in, a place that stayed comfortably unfinished. Emma liked to say we were a team. She said it in front of friends, in front of family, even in front of strangers at parties. Like repeating it often enough made it true. But most decisions had already been made, usually in her head, then delivered to me like an update. We're going to dinner with my coworkers Thursday. We're spending Christmas with my parents this year. We're refinancing. It makes sense. When I hesitated, she'd tilt her head and smile, patient, the way you'd smile at someone who was slow but harmless. "You worry too much," she'd say. Or, "You overthink everything." If I pushed back, really pushed, she'd sigh like I was draining her. Then she'd say something that sounded reasonable but felt like a door closing. "I just need you to trust me." I wasn't the kind of man who enjoyed conflict. I'd grown up in a house where raising your voice meant you were losing. My dad never yelled. He'd just go quiet, fix something in the garage, and the problem would either resolve or it would become permanent. I learned early that calm was a form of control, and I thought I was practicing that. What I didn't realize was that I confused calm with surrender. In the beginning, Emma's confidence felt like a relief. She had opinions. She had plans. She made reservations, booked hotels, ordered for the table without looking at the menu too long. When we were dating, it was easy to interpret that as strength. I told myself I was lucky. I told myself it balanced me out. Then the balance started tipping. Little things first. She corrected my stories in front of people. Not harshly, almost playfully. "No, that's not how it happened," she'd say, laughing like I was adorable. If I said we'd been somewhere in 2018, she'd insist it was 2019. If I remembered a conversation differently, she'd say, "You always do that," and the room would laugh with her like it was a known trait. At home, she'd speak for me on the phone with contractors or customer service. I'd be standing right there, and she'd reach over and take the phone like it was natural. "He doesn't know all the details," she'd say. "I handle this stuff." I started letting her. When tension appeared, I called it stress. When she dismissed me, I called it a bad day. When she came home late with that bright, charged energy people get from being around other people all day, and she barely looked at me as she moved through the house, I told myself she was tired. There were always explanations available if you wanted them. And I wanted them, because looking too closely meant admitting something I wasn't ready to name. That I'd been shrinking in my own life, not all at once, but by degrees. Like a belt you tighten one notch at a time until one day you can't breathe right and you can't remember when it started. After what she said at the table, the night didn't replay in my head the way arguments usually do. There was no looping of tone or wording, no imagined comebacks. Instead, it was like someone had turned on a light behind me, and suddenly everything I'd walked past without noticing was visible all at once. I started seeing small moments that had never felt important enough to hold on to. The way Emma answered questions that were directed at me, not out of urgency, but out of habit. The way she summarized my opinions before I finished forming them. "He doesn't really care either way," she'd say, and I'd nod, because it was easier than correcting her and watching the temperature in the room drop. I noticed how often she used humor as a blade. Nothing overt, just comments wrapped in smiles. If I hesitated before making a decision, she'd laugh and say, "That's why I handle the big stuff." If I questioned a plan she'd already announced, she'd shake her head like I was being difficult for sport. "You always do this," she'd say. "Not sometimes. Always." Driving home from work, I started replaying conversations from months back, even years. Not to accuse her, but to understand myself. There were entire stretches of time where my role had been reduced to agreement. When had that happened? I tried to locate the moment where I'd handed that ground over, but it wasn't a single event. It was cumulative. 1,000 small allowances stacked neatly on top of each other. At work, I began to notice the contrast. On job sites, people waited for my call. They asked my opinion because it mattered. If I said no, it meant no. If I needed more time, they gave it. There was friction, sure, but it was clean. Nobody pretended decisions were shared when they weren't. Nobody smiled while taking something from me. At home, everything was smoother on the surface and tighter underneath. Emma framed her certainty as efficiency. Her control as care. She told people she took the mental load, and they nodded like she was doing me a favor. I let them believe it. I'd let myself believe it. What changed after that night wasn't my behavior. It was my attention. I started listening to how she spoke when she didn't think she was being cruel. I noticed how often she used absolutes, always, never, everyone agrees. I paid attention to how quickly she dismissed anything that slowed her momentum. I watched how she checked my reactions, not for understanding, but for compliance. If I agreed, she moved on. If I didn't, she pressed harder or wrapped the pressure in concern. None of it felt random anymore. It looked like a pattern. And once you see a pattern, you can't unsee it. You stop asking why each individual thing happened and start asking what it all adds up to. I wasn't being misunderstood. I was being managed, reduced to a variable she thought she'd already solved. The realization didn't come with heat. It came with distance. Like stepping back from a wall and finally seeing the shape of the whole structure instead of the crack you'd been staring at. I didn't feel wronged so much as misplaced. I was living in a version of my life where my presence was assumed, my silence expected, and my independence treated like a flaw. That's when I understood something else, quieter but heavier. This wasn't going to fix itself. Not with better communication, not with patience, not with time, because the arrangement worked exactly as designed, for her. And I had helped design it by not objecting soon enough. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain myself or look around the table to see who was watching. I stood up. The movement was quiet enough that it took a second for anyone to notice. My chair slid back just far enough to clear my legs. I reached into my wallet, counted cash without looking at the bill numbers, and set it on the edge of the table. Not dramatically, just deliberately. Enough to cover my share and then some. Emma finally looked at me then. Her smile faltered, confused, like she'd skipped a step in a routine she'd done 100 times before. "Where are you going?" she asked, half laughing, as if this was a bit I'd forgotten to rehearse. "I'm done for the night," I said. That was it. No accusation, no summary, no performance. I nodded once to the people around the table, faces frozen somewhere between discomfort and curiosity, and walked out. The air outside felt cooler than it should have, or maybe I just noticed it for the first time that evening. The parking lot lights buzzed faintly. Cars idled. A group of people laughed somewhere near the entrance, unaware that anything significant had just ended 20 yards away. I got in my truck and drove without thinking about direction. Not fast, not angry, just forward. At the first exit that offered a vacancy sign, I took it. The motel smelled like old carpet and industrial cleaner. The clerk didn't look up when I checked in. I signed my name, took the keycard, and walked to a room that looked exactly like every other temporary place I'd ever stayed. Beige walls, a bed too firm, a table with one chair. I sat down and let the silence settle. There was no panic, no rush of regret. My phone buzzed on the bedspread where I'd dropped it, but I didn't reach for it yet. I stared at the opposite wall and noticed a small crack running diagonally from the corner of the window frame. It reminded me of job sites, how damage always starts small, almost polite, before it spreads. That was when it hit me. Not as emotion, but as certainty. I was done trying to earn space in my own life. I'd spent years adjusting my posture, my timing, my expectations, rounding off parts of myself so they wouldn't catch on her edges. I'd framed it as compromise, as maturity, as love, but sitting there alone, with no one correcting me or filling the quiet, I understood how much energy it had taken just to remain acceptable. My phone buzzed again, and again. I picked it up this time, not to respond, just to see. Missed calls, messages stacking up, the first few sharp, then confused, then concerned. The progression was predictable enough that it almost felt like reading a script I already knew by heart. I set the phone face down. Lying on the bed, fully dressed, I didn't feel like I was running away. I felt like I'd finally stopped running in place. There was no plan yet. No next step. Just the awareness that something fundamental had shifted, and it wasn't going to shift back. For the first time in a long while, I didn't need to explain myself to anyone. And in that cheap room, with traffic murmuring outside and nothing demanding my agreement, I made a quiet decision that didn't require witnesses. I was done proving that I deserved to exist on my own terms. My phone kept lighting up through the night, vibrating against the cheap laminate nightstand like it wanted to crawl back to me. I didn't answer. I didn't silence it either. I let it run until the battery dipped low enough that the screen dimmed between notifications. In the morning, I sat at the small table with a paper cup of motel coffee and finally started reading. The first messages were sharp. "Where did you go?" Then defensive. That was taken out of context. Then corrective. "You embarrassed me." By mid-morning, the tone shifted. "Are you okay? Please call me. I'm worried." I didn't respond to any of it. I wasn't trying to punish her. I was trying to understand what I'd been living inside. Reading without reacting changed everything. When you don't answer, you notice repetition. Phrases recycled with slight adjustments. Concern paired with blame. Apologies that never quite landed on responsibility. Care that required compliance. She wasn't asking where I was because she missed me. She was asking because I'd stepped outside her field of view. I scrolled back through older messages, weeks and months worth. Patterns surfaced quickly once I wasn't defending myself in real time. Every disagreement followed the same arc. She asserted certainty. I hesitated. She reframed my hesitation as a problem. Then she closed the loop by positioning herself as the stabilizing force. "I just want what's best for us. You know I have to think for both of us sometimes. I worry about you when you get like this." It was always, yes, but the direction only ever ran one way. That afternoon, I opened my email and searched a word I hadn't thought about in a while: Boise. The message came up immediately. A subject line from almost a year earlier, still unread after the first skim. A job offer from a regional firm expanding operations in Idaho. Better pay, more autonomy. A role that trusted my judgment instead of buffering it through layers of approval. I remembered the conversation when I'd mentioned it to Emma. How quickly she'd dismissed it. Too far, too disruptive, too risky. She'd said it would be irresponsible to even consider it. She'd framed staying as loyalty, leaving as abandonment. I declined the offer 2 days later. For us, sitting there in that motel room, I reread the email slowly. No emotion attached, just information, responsibilities, expectations, a start date that could be negotiated. It wasn't a fantasy. It was a door I'd closed without checking what was on the other side. My phone buzzed again. Another message slid onto the screen, softer than the last. "We should talk like adults." I set the phone down and opened my laptop. I wasn't angry. I wasn't trying to escape. I was documenting reality. The way I would on a job site when something wasn't lining up. Measure twice. Verify the numbers, don't guess. I took screenshots. Saved messages. Not for leverage. For clarity. That's when I understood what I was actually doing. I wasn't gathering evidence against her. I was gathering proof for myself that I wasn't imagining things. Once that clicked, the noise fell away. The urgency disappeared. I wasn't waiting for the next message anymore. I was already somewhere else, mentally. Somewhere quiet, where my decisions didn't need approval and my absence didn't trigger alarms. I replied to the email from Boise with a simple sentence. Is the position still available? Then I closed the laptop and finished my coffee, already aware that something irreversible had started moving forward, whether anyone else was ready for it or not. I heard back from Boise the next morning. Short email. Direct. Professional. The position was still open. They'd need an answer quickly. A start date within 2 weeks would be ideal, but they could make adjustments if necessary. I stared at the screen longer than I needed to. Not because I was unsure, but because I recognized the moment for what it was. A clean intersection. No traffic. No pressure. Just a choice that hadn't been filtered through someone else's expectations. I replied before I could overthink it. Accepted the offer. Signed the contract electronically an hour later. Once that was done, the rest fell into place with a kind of quiet efficiency that surprised me. I booked a one-way flight. Reserved a short-term rental close to the office. Not fancy. Functional. Somewhere I could think. I didn't announce it. I didn't explain myself. I packed what mattered: clothes, documents, tools I'd collected over the years that Emma had never quite approved of cluttering the house. I left behind the things that felt shared or heavy or symbolic. Not as a statement, as a simplification. 10 days later, I was standing in an airport watching the gate agent scan my boarding pass. No one stopped me. No one asked for justification. The world didn't push back. Boise was colder than I expected. Clear air. Wide streets. The kind of place where people looked you in the eye when they spoke. The office was smaller than what I was used to, but better organized. Fewer layers. More trust. On my first day, no one told me how to think. They showed me the operation and asked what I noticed. When I pointed out inefficiencies, they listened. When I suggested changes, they asked when I could implement them. It felt unfamiliar at first, being taken at face value. I realized how used I'd become to defending every position, softening every statement, checking my footing before speaking. Outside of work, my life simplified quickly. I ate when I was hungry. Slept when I was tired. I didn't have to coordinate my moods or preemptively apologize for needing quiet. The absence of commentary was its own kind of relief. Emma's messages continued for a while. She'd found out where I was through mutual connections. The tone shifted again: shock, then anger, then disbelief. She accused me of abandoning her, of being impulsive, of throwing away everything we'd built. I didn't argue. I didn't correct the narrative. I understood something then that I hadn't before. What she called us had always been structured around her gravity. Remove it, and the system couldn't hold. What started as a private conflict had become a concrete reality. A new job, a new city, a new rhythm that didn't revolve around managing someone else's reactions. There was no rush of triumph. Just a steady sense of alignment. My days made sense again. My energy went where it was needed, not where it was demanded. I wasn't starting over. I was continuing, without interference. Emma showed up 3 weeks after I started in Boise. No warning. No message asking if it was a good time. I found out because the receptionist buzzed my extension and said there was a woman in the lobby asking for me by full name, voice tight like she already knew this wasn't normal. When I stepped out, she was standing near the window, coat still on, eyes red but focused. She looked smaller than I remembered, or maybe I was seeing her without the distortion of proximity for the first time. She smiled when she saw me, like relief had been waiting its turn. "I just needed to see you," she said. I nodded once. Didn't invite her in. Didn't sit down. She started talking immediately. Apologies first, vague, carefully shaped. She was sorry if I'd misunderstood. Sorry if she'd sounded dismissive. Sorry things had spiraled. Then the apologies turned into explanations. Stress at work. Pressure. Fear. She said she'd only been trying to hold things together. I let her talk. People think confrontation is about volume. It isn't. It's about position. I didn't lean in. I didn't step back. I stayed where I was and let the words wash past me without grabbing any of them. Then the pressure came. She said I was being unreasonable. That disappearing like I did was cruel. That marriage meant working through things, not running. She said I was making a mistake. That I'd regret this once the novelty wore off. That I needed her more than I realized. There it was. The same structure. Concern wrapped around control. I spoke once. This isn't a discussion, I said. Calm. Level. Not defensive. You need to leave. Her face changed then. Not anger. Calculation. She tried again, softer. She reached for my arm and stopped herself halfway, like she remembered the setting. She said we could start fresh. Counseling. Boundaries. New rules. I looked past her to the hallway, then back. Please go, I said. She didn't move. I walked to the front desk and asked security to escort her out. When I came back, she was crying. Real tears this time. She asked how I could do this to her. How I could shut her out like this. The guard stood beside her, professional, patient. As they led her toward the door, she turned and said my name like it was a warning. I didn't respond. Standing there afterward, I understood something clean and final. She didn't lose me. She lost control. And without that, there was nothing left for her to argue with. After that, things moved without my involvement, like a system that had already been set in motion and no longer needed adjustment. I didn't follow up. I didn't check in. I let the absence do its work. At the office, my days settled into a rhythm that felt earned. I arrived early, left on time, and carried my work home only in the sense that I thought about solutions while cooking dinner or walking in the evening. People trusted me with decisions, and I returned that trust by being precise. When something broke, I fixed it. When something worked, I left it alone. Confidence returned quietly. Not as bravado, not as performance. It showed up in small, unremarkable ways. I stopped second-guessing emails before sending them. I answered questions directly. I said no without apology and yes without explanation. Outside of work, relationships simplified. I met people who took my words at face value. Conversations didn't feel like negotiations. There was no undercurrent to manage, no emotional weather system I had to track before speaking. If I didn't want to go somewhere, I said so. If I did, I went. Nothing collapsed as a result. The divorce paperwork arrived by email first, then by mail. Emma had filed sooner than I expected. Maybe urgency finally worked against her. I read through everything carefully, line by line. There were no surprises. No hidden hooks. She'd assumed I would contest more than I did. I didn't. I hired an attorney recommended by a colleague. Efficient. Unemotional. We spoke twice. He asked what I wanted. I told him I wanted it finished cleanly. He nodded like that was a reasonable request. The process moved faster after that. Assets divided. Accounts separated. The house sold. I took what was fair and left what wasn't worth the cost of dragging out. There were no dramatic hearings. No scenes. Just signatures and confirmations. Emma tried once more to slow it down. A message framed as nostalgia. A reminder of shared history. I didn't respond. The silence answered for me. When the final notice came through, I read it once and archived it. No weight lifted. No void opened. Just confirmation of something that had already happened long before the paperwork caught up. Life continued. Work expanded. I took on more responsibility. I trained people who reminded me of who I used to be, capable, cautious, waiting for permission they didn't need. I didn't lecture them. I gave them space to figure it out. Some evenings, I sat alone and noticed how little tension lived in my body. My shoulders stayed down. My jaw stayed loose. I slept through the night without waking up rehearsing conversations that hadn't happened yet. Nothing extraordinary followed, and that was the point. The drama had ended because it no longer had a stage. What remained was steady, unremarkable progress. The kind you only notice when you look back and realize you haven't been bracing yourself for a long time. Things didn't improve because I won. They improved because I stopped participating in something that required me to lose. I didn't celebrate when it was over. There was no moment where I raised a glass or marked the day on a calendar. I didn't feel like something had been won. I didn't feel like something had been taken from me either. It just ended. The absence of reaction surprised me at first. I'd expected some delayed wave, relief, grief, anger, something. Instead, there was a flatness that felt honest. Like finishing a long job and cleaning up the site afterward. You don't cheer when the last bolt is tightened. You just put your tools away and go home. The world didn't change around me. Traffic still backed up on the freeway. Emails still came in flagged urgent when they weren't. People still complained about the weather like it was personal. What changed was internal. The pressure to manage someone else's perception of me was gone. The constant calibration, how will this sound? How will that land? What will it cost me later? Had dissolved. I noticed it in my body before my thoughts caught up. My breathing stayed even. I didn't feel the need to fill silence. When something went wrong, I addressed it directly instead of bracing for the secondary fallout. There was no audience anymore. I stopped explaining my choices to people who weren't affected by them. When coworkers asked why I'd moved so quickly or why I seemed different, I shrugged and said it was time. That answer was enough. Anyone who needed more wasn't actually asking. On weekends, I worked with my hands. Fixed things around the place I was renting. Replaced a broken outlet. Built shelves that didn't match anything but held what I needed them to hold. The work felt grounding. Direct input, direct output. No interpretation required. Sometimes, late in the evening, I thought about how easily my life had been narrated for me before. How often I'd accepted a smaller version of myself because it was presented as reasonable. I didn't feel embarrassed by it anymore. I understood it. Stability can look like safety even when it's just constrained wearing a clean label. I didn't miss Emma. Not in the way people expect. I missed the idea of what I thought we were building once, long ago. But that idea had been abandoned long before I walked out of that restaurant. I'd just been the last one to admit it. What I felt instead was space. Not freedom in the dramatic sense. Space to choose without defending the choice. Space to be quiet without being accused of withdrawal. Space to exist without being assessed. I wasn't trying to prove independence. I was practicing it. There's a difference. One requires an audience. The other doesn't. And in that difference, I found something steady. A kind of dignity that didn't announce itself. A calm that didn't need agreement. I wasn't made smaller anymore so someone else could feel bigger. I was simply present in my own life. That was enough. A year later, I sat on the porch of a place I chose myself, watching the sun drop behind the line of trees at the edge of the property. The house wasn't impressive. It didn't need to be. It fit me. Every decision about it had been made without negotiation or justification, and that mattered more than square footage. The air was still. No traffic noise. No voices bleeding through walls. Just the sound of wind moving through leaves and a screen door creaking somewhere down the block. I noticed how easily my thoughts settled now. They didn't race ahead or double back. They stayed where I was. Every so often, someone from my past would reach out with an update about Emma. A new job, a new relationship, a new version of the same story. I listened politely and let it pass. Whatever she was doing no longer intersected with my life in any meaningful way. She had been convinced I needed her. That without her structure, her direction, her management, I would fall apart. That belief had been the foundation of everything she'd built around me. That was her biggest mistake. I hadn't needed to prove anything by leaving. I hadn't needed to replace what I walked away from. All I had to do was remove myself from a narrative that required me to be smaller than I was. Sitting there as the light faded, I understood something simple and permanent. I didn't escape my life. I finally stepped into it.